Will President Trump order US troops into Mexico? In December 2024, the incoming president raised the prospect of sending US forces into neighbouring Mexico to take on the drug cartels, which have been at the forefront of an addiction crisis in the United States. However, while the Mexican president has roundly rejected such a move, arguing that it would violate her country's sovereignty, Trump insists that something needs to be done. So, could he really send American soldiers into Mexico to fight the increasingly well-armed drug gangs? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. What are the limits of self-defence in international relations? Traditionally, we thought of it as one country defending itself against attack by another. But the boundaries have become increasingly blurred. Today, serious questions have emerged over appropriate responses to non-military threats, such as cyber attacks and hybrid warfare. Likewise, the emergence of non-state actors, such as transnational terrorist organisations and paramilitary criminal gangs, has also raised questions about whether and when armed forces can be used to retaliate on the territory of another sovereign state. All this has come to the fore with President Trump's recent statements that he'd be willing to take on the drug cartels in Mexico. There's little doubt that illegal drugs have done enormous damage to the United States. Indeed, some have estimated that the annual death toll is now over 100,000 and that the total yearly cost of the country is around $1 trillion. But is it really possible that the United States would send in its forces without the permission of the Mexican government to try to tackle the problem? The United Mexican States lie at the crossing point between North and Central America. To its north is the United States of America, and to its south it borders Belize and Guatemala. To its east lies the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Meanwhile, the Pacific Ocean lies on its western coast. The country is just under 2 million square kilometres, or around 760,000 square miles, making it the world's 13th largest state, and is divided into 32 federal units, including Mexico City. The population currently stands at around 130 million. The histories of the United States and Mexico are deeply intertwined. While Spain conquered Central and South America in the 16th century and British colonists settled North America's eastern coast during the 17th century, our story really starts following the creation of an independent Mexican state in 1821. From the start, relations between Mexico and the United States were strained. While Mexico held vast territories, including present-day Texas, California, and the American Southwest, the United States was steadily pushing westwards. This came to a head when Texas, with its many American settlers, declared independence in 1836. Following this, a decade later, a full-scale war saw Mexico cede half its territory to the United States. By the end of the 19th century, the relationship between the two had become increasingly unequal. While Mexico grappled with political instability and dictatorship, US companies had come to dominate key sectors such as mining, oil drilling, and railway construction. However, while the Mexican Revolution saw the country resist US influence, relations improved again during the Second World War as the US came to rely on Mexican workers to address national labour shortages. Following on from this, during the Cold War, Mexico attempted to balance its close economic relations with the United States against its wish to remain distant from active US efforts to limit the spread of communism in Central and South America. However, by the 1980s, relations had shifted firmly back to an economic focus. While the creation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 1994 boosted economic ties, it also increased income inequality. This, in turn, fueled significant illicit Mexican migration into the United States. But while this became an increasingly crucial domestic issue in the US, the relationship also became increasingly strained by another factor: the growth of drug trafficking. While there was a time when the United States had no specific laws against drugs, this began to change in the early 20th century when many substances were prohibited. However, the crucial moment came in the 1960s. Against the backdrop of radical social change, recreational drug use rapidly increased. All this fed a growing demand for cocaine, which was being grown in the Andes Mountains of Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia. As the effects of increased drug use began to be felt more widely, President Nixon launched the war on drugs in June 1971. But while this led to several crucial measures to tackle the trade, such as the establishment of the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, demand continued to surge. As a result, by the start of the 1980s, several major cartels had emerged in Colombia to oversee the production and smuggling of cocaine into the United States. Initially, efforts to wipe out the trade met with mixed success. Although measures were taken to eradicate coca crops, intercept shipments, and extradite the heads of the cartels to the United States, new routes and actors continually emerged. As a result, the wealthy and heavily armed cartels came to hold significant power. However, by the late 1990s, US efforts had managed to dismantle the Colombian cartels. Instead, it was at this point that the focus shifted to Mexico. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please consider giving it a like and perhaps subscribing if you haven't already. Thanks so much. And now, back to the video. Although Mexico had always been a part of the US strategy to combat drug smuggling, especially as the country served as a central hub for access to the United States, the decline of the Colombian cartels radically changed things. Exploiting the ever-growing demand for drugs in the United States and Mexico's weak law enforcement and extensive corruption, Mexican cartels soon stepped into the void, shifting attention to heroin, marijuana, and the production of synthetic drugs such as methamphetamines. While the United States attempted to address the issue with increased border security, eradication programs, and military aid to Mexico, relations became increasingly strained, especially as the flow of drugs northwards into the United States was matched by an increased flow of arms south into Mexico. This, in turn, saw the Mexican drug organizations become increasingly well-armed, well-organized, and dangerous. And while Mexico launched a significant crackdown in 2006, which saw the military brought in to tackle the problem, this only made the problem much worse as the gangs began to splinter, feeding vicious turf wars. Today, the Mexican drug cartels, including groups such as the Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and others, have become some of the most significant criminal organizations in the world. Heavily armed and well-trained, they've become steadily more deadly. This in turn has seen a massive increase in murder rates. Indeed, overall, it's believed that more than 300,000 people have been killed over the past 20 years, including many high-profile assassinations of politicians and journalists. Meanwhile, the effects of all this have been increasingly felt in the United States. For a start, there's the steadily growing opioid crisis. In recent years, the massive growth in the use of fentanyl, a synthetic drug manufactured in Mexico from Chinese ingredients, has become a major public health issue in the United States, with over 100,000 deaths recorded in 2023. Meanwhile, the cartels have steadily expanded their criminal activities into the US, carrying out killings, extortions, kidnappings, and money laundering. In addition, they've also expanded into human trafficking, thus feeding into long-standing US concerns over immigration. It's against this backdrop that Donald Trump has weighed in. Speaking in December 2024, he announced plans to tackle the growing opioid crisis. As well as launching a public awareness campaign, he announced his intention to designate the Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations. This would put them on the same footing as groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. As well as expanding the range of legal steps that could be taken against the groups, including asset seizures, it would also open the way for possible military action, including drone strikes and targeted raids by the US military into Mexico. And it's this final point that stirred up the latest controversy. Responding to the threats, Mexico's President, Claudia Sheinbaum, rejected the idea of US military action. Highlighting that this would violate Mexico's sovereignty, she underscored that bilateral cooperation would achieve much better results. So, will Trump go ahead and make the designation? First, it's worth emphasising that such threats aren't new. They first emerged in 2019 when Trump suggested that US forces could intervene after 9 American citizens were murdered in northern Mexico by suspected cartel members. However, he eventually backed off following pressure from the then Mexican president, who was trying to tackle the social and economic roots of the problem rather than take the militarised approach that had previously failed. The trouble is that little apparent progress has been made since then. Indeed, the opioid crisis has become ever more serious in the United States, where fentanyl is now involved in most drug-related deaths. This was highlighted during the presidential election in the United States, when the opioid crisis was a leading issue on the campaign trail. As a result, as he begins his second term and going by his statements, Trump now appears to see this as a significant issue for his second presidency. Given that his previous decision to hold off has seemingly failed to produce results, he may now feel that he needs to act this time. But what happens if he goes ahead and makes the decision? Of course, any military action would have profound effects. While supporters of the idea, including many Republican lawmakers, insist that it would be a clear and decisive step towards tackling one of the biggest problems facing the United States, critics warn of dangerous consequences. In addition to profoundly damaging US-Mexican relations, they point out that it would violate international law. But there are other factors to consider. Leaving aside the operational challenges of such a mission, others highlight the possible unintended consequences of military intervention. These could include counterattacks on targets within the United States, as well as the killing or kidnapping of American visitors to Mexico. If the US then retaliates further, this could see the situation quickly escalate. Instead, they urge caution and have called for a more cooperative approach. Ultimately, though, the United States is clearly facing a significant public health and security crisis. However, as Mexican cartels have evolved into global enterprises, tackling them has become increasingly difficult. The question is whether designating them as terrorist groups and pursuing a militarized strategy is indeed the right approach, especially as this will violate Mexico's sovereignty and will inevitably make cooperation in other areas, such as migration and economic development, even more difficult. In the meantime, all this highlights the complexities of balancing national security with respect for international sovereignty and bilateral cooperation. In addition, it also underscores the long and complex relationship between the United States of America and the United Mexican States. Of course, this isn't the only threat that President Trump has made. Here are some other videos on his recent claims against the Panama Canal and Greenland.